The fourth and final type of tissue that we're going to talk about is connective tissue. And connective tissue is the most diverse class of tissues. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. And I kind of think of it as like a catch-all. So when it comes to tissues in the body, if it's not epithelial tissue, and remember that epithelial tissue is always named something like simple squamous or stratified squamous or simple cuboidal. So epithelial tissue has that naming convention, plus it says epithelial tissue. So it's simple squamous epithelium. Muscle tissue, you've got those three types that we talked about. So we talked about skeletal muscle, we talked about cardiac muscle, and we talked about smooth muscle. So you know that those are the types of muscle. Nervous tissue doesn't really have subtypes. It's just nervous tissue that's found in the brain or the spinal cord or the nerves, etc., etc. So if it doesn't fit into one of those other three categories, then it fits into connective tissue. And so examples of subtypes of connective tissue include things like your bone tissue, which is also called osseous tissue, your fat, which is also called adipose tissue. The blood is a type of connective tissue. Cartilage is a type of connective tissue. And there are also some types of connective tissue that are just kind of called fibrous connective tissue. And you can have dense fibrous connective tissue. And you can have loose fibrous connective tissue or just loose connective tissue. And there are some other kind of subcategories, but those are kind of the main ones that we're really going to focus on and look at kind of where they're located and what they do. When it comes to the location of connective tissue, it's basically everywhere. Especially the fibrous connective tissues, they kind of serve as like the glue that fills in the spaces between other tissue types and helps to anchor other tissue types in place. And so there's connective tissue just everywhere. But some more specific examples of where you're going to find connective tissue is, once again, your blood is connective tissue, your bones, cartilage, tendons, ligaments, fat, and like I said, pretty much everywhere. So you're going to find it in between other tissues. You're going to find it kind of packaged around other kind of organs as well. So all the different types of connective tissue have different types of structures, but there's kind of one key component of connective tissue that applies to most, if not all, connective tissues. And so the kind of the key general kind of designation of connective tissue is that the cells are typically spread out, meaning that they may not even touch. And there's also an extensive extracellular matrix. And the extracellular matrix is all the stuff outside the cell. All right, so we'll just say the stuff outside the cell. Now, there are kind of like two components to the extracellular matrix. There is what we call the ground substance, and the ground substance is often fluid or a liquid of some sort. And so this would be the extracellular fluid that we've talked about before. But sometimes the ground substance also kind of takes on different structures to it. So, for example, in bones, the extracellular matrix is kind of packed with minerals, especially calcium. In cartilage, the extracellular matrix is kind of like a firm, squishy texture. So it kind of depends on the different types of connective tissue, but generally speaking, there's this stuff that is often fluid, but sometimes has some other stuff in it. The other component of the extracellular matrix are proteins, and they're often these protein fibers. And so a protein fiber is just kind of like a long like strand or string of a protein. So let's say that we have these cells that are kind of hanging out here. And then outside the cells, you would have these like protein fibers that kind of make a mesh or a matrix. And they might go in different directions. So I'm just kind of drawing it like a grid here. But we'll take a look at some pictures of what these look like through a microscope. And you'll see that the arrangement of these proteins can be very different depending on what the tissue is. But these would be the protein fibers of the extracellular matrix. And then kind of embedded or surrounding those protein fibers, you would have that ground substance. So the ground substance could be fluid, like I mentioned, or it might be packed with minerals, like in your bone. Or it could be kind of squishy if it's making up the cartilage. So it kind of just depends on the type of connective tissue. So just notice how the cells are kind of spaced out, so they're not touching each other, which in the other types of tissues, they're usually touching each other or in close proximity, whereas oftentimes in connective tissue, they're not touching and they're kind of spread out. Now, there are exceptions to that rule because there are always exceptions to that rule, but that's kind of the general idea of how connective tissues are structured. And because connective tissue is such a diverse class of tissues, it also has a diverse range of functions. So some of the functions include things like protection. So for example, cartilage protects the ends of your bones. Bones provide protection. Fat provides protection and cushioning. It can connect structures, which the name kind of tells you that. So examples of that are things like tendons and ligaments. Connective tissue can transport materials. For example, the blood can transport nutrients and waste products and just kind of other stuff like proteins and hormones around the body. Connective tissue can store minerals. For example, the bones store calcium. It can provide support. So once again, the bones help to support you and help you stand upright. And there are more, but these are kind of the main functions that we're going to see in the different connective tissues. So let's take a look at what some of these different types of connective tissues look like through a microscope. So here we're looking at dense fibrous connective tissue. And once again, here we're kind of zoomed in to probably 400x. And I'm not sure if this one is 40 or 100. Unfortunately, my labels did not transfer with the picture. So, but we'll say that's, kind of zoomed out a little bit. And so what you're looking at here is that each one of these kind of long black spots here is the nucleus of a cell. And then all of this kind of pink stuff outside, so all of this area here, and you can kind of see that it's running in these kind of like long strings of proteins here. But basically, all of this pink area here is that extracellular matrix that we were talking about. So once again, we've got these cells that are kind of spaced out and not touching each other. And then we've got a ton of that extracellular matrix kind of packed in there in between the cells. And dense fibrous connective tissue would be found in things like tendons and ligaments. And a tendon connects muscle to bone, and ligaments connect bones to bones. So once again, they're kind of their main their main function is to connect structures to each other. In this picture, we've got loose fibrous connective tissue. And so once again, what we're looking at here, these dark spots here are going to be the nuclei of cells. And you can see a whole bunch of those around here. And then these long strings that are both the dark purple and also these kind of lighter light purple back here, these are going to be the proteins of the extracellular matrix. And so basically all of this kind of pink and dark purple stuff that is surrounding the cells, all of this is that extracellular matrix. So once again, we see these cells that are spread out and not touching each other, and there's a lot of extracellular matrix kind of packed in between. Another type of connective tissue is osseous tissue, which is kind of more commonly just referred to as your bones. So your bone tissue is known as osseous tissue. So if we look at this tissue underneath a microscope, just to kind of help you see or help you understand what you're looking at, osseous tissue is arranged in these kind of units known as an osteon. So this kind of whole area here is known as an osteon. And in the middle of that osteon, there's actually a hole, and it's actually a canal that's going kind of down through this cylinder of tissue, and that's called the central canal. And through that central canal, there would be blood vessels and lymphatic vessels and nerves kind of running through the bone to get to different parts of the bone. Now, looking at the tissue itself, these little dark spots here are the cells. And then all of the kind of beige stuff kind of in between. So basically all of this stuff out here that's making up the majority of the osseous tissue is going to be that extracellular matrix. Remember that we mentioned in osseous tissue, the extracellular matrix, the ground substance is really packed with minerals. And the kind of the primary mineral is calcium, but there's also some phosphate in there as well. This picture is showing you adipose tissue that's kind of sandwiched in between some other tissues. So remember that your adipose tissue is your fat. And so it's not referring to these tissues here. These actually look like muscle tissue kind of around here. But this kind of lacy looking area here, this is your fat. This is your adipose tissue. And so what we're looking at is basically this is a cell in adipose tissue. So this kind of ring around it, that's going to be the cell membrane. And the nucleus of these cells are often pushed up kind of against the wall of the cell. And that's because all of this kind of light colored white area here, that's actually it's fat molecules. And so your fat cells are literally cell membranes that are just jam-packed with fat, and then all the organelles in the nucleus just kind of get pushed up against the side. Another type of connective tissue is cartilage, and there's actually 3 different types of cartilage, but the one I'm showing here is called hyaline cartilage, and it is the most common in the human body, so that's kind of why I chose to show you this one. And once again, it's kind of showing you this cartilage that's sandwiched between these kind of other tissues. So it's basically this area is the hyaline cartilage. This area around it is not hyaline cartilage. So this is like other tissues that are kind of surrounding it here. And if we kind of zoom in to take a closer look at the hyaline cartilage here, what we're seeing are, once again, these kind of cells here. So this dark spot here, so this is the nucleus of a cell. And then all of this pink area out here, kind of in between the cells, is the extracellular matrix. So once again, we have the cells are spaced out, they're not touching, and there's a lot of extracellular matrix. And in cartilage, the extracellular matrix is kind of squishy. So it's kind of got it's kind of like smooth, but then it also has like a little bit of give to it, but it's also kind of hard. It's kind of an interesting texture to try to explain. So the next time you're eating like a chicken wing, if you look at the end of the bone of the chicken wing or the chicken leg, you'll see kind of like a pearly white like substance that is covering the end of the bone, and that's hyaline cartilage. So you can kind of look at that and kind of like poke it and you can kind of get an idea of what the texture is like. And then the last connective tissue that we're going to talk about is the blood. And the blood has kind of like 3 different solid components in it. So it has red blood cells, it has white blood cells, and it has platelets. And so the red blood cells are the most numerous. And so these kind of red circles here, so these are your red blood cells. These kind of sparser cells that are kind of bigger and they have that kind of purple color to them, these are your white blood cells. And these little teeny tiny, they're actually cellular fragments that are kind of all over the place here. Those are the platelets. And then all of this area out here, so all of this kind of like background area that I'm now coloring in kind of like blue, this is the extracellular matrix of the blood. And blood's kind of unique in the sense that the extracellular matrix only has fluid. So there are no protein kind of fibers making up a matrix. The extracellular matrix is only liquid. So it's got a liquid or fluid extracellular matrix, and it's actually called the plasma.